Hello, good afternoon. Today our guest is Tam Alex. Hello, Tam. How are you doing?
Well, hi Lipton, how are you?
I'm great. Tam Alex is an entrepreneur, a writer, and a Nigerian who's based in the United States. So, Tam, I am a big fan of Nigeria's history. I love researching the Igbos. I'm a fan of an academic called Femi Agdebulu, and obviously, I love Nollywood movies.
That's great. I love it.
Yeah, I like patience.
Nice. Patience was awkward, right?
Yes, yes. Are you fond of Nollywood movies?
Oh, yes, for sure.
Yeah, I love the Patience. I like Ucheria. I like Hulu Jacobs, Pete Edochie, Rita. I like Nigerian movies because of the history. It is so rich and enriching. Whenever I watch it, my consciousness is just illuminated. So, for example, years ago, Pete Edochie and Rachel Oniga starred in a film depicting the trials of being a member of the Husu tribe the Husu group in Nigeria.
Hmm.
So that sparked my interest. And interestingly, I saw a piece in the BBC saying that even today, such people are still encountering trials in Nigeria.
It's interesting.
Yeah, that was a bit shocking. Like I assumed that Nigerians were no longer interested in the history of the descendants of the enslaved, but I guess I was wrong. So Tam, you are a libertarian and recently you wrote an article for the Journal of Libertarian Studies. The Journal of Libertarian Studies is a publication of the Ludwig von Mises Institute, and your piece is titled "It Belongs to Me, a Libertarian Analysis of Property Rights in Nigeria." It is over 20 pages. We will not engage in a page-by-page analysis. Therefore, I will read interesting snippets for our viewers. Firstly, Tam, in the piece, you write, public schools are decrepit, roads are in bad condition, and in many parts of the country are non-existent. Government hospitals and clinics are littered with the macabre and city waste are littered with the macabre and city waste systems are cesspools of diseases waiting to inflict the next epidemic on the people. In short, the Nigerian government provides hardly anything of value to increase the standard of living of its people. Why is the government of Nigeria so defective?
That's a big question, and I think a lot of books have been written on that. So, people have many reasons for that.
Give me your
Um,
opinion.
uh, it's much more. I feel like okay, first of all, is the purpose of what a government is and what the role of a government should be, right? And this is why you know, I I I lean or I am a libertarian because I think that if you want a government, the government should focus largely on the protection of its people and on their rights. And those rights existed outside the government. So people came together to set up government to protect rights that they had before governments. So they don't have rights because the government gives them those rights. They have rights because they had it before the government and they have a government to protect those rights. But the modern state does other things, gets much more involved in people's lives and up to the minutiae level with respect to how many kids you can have, how many things you can do. That process alone leads to a lot of centralized power. And what does power do in itself when you have too much of it? According to Lord Acton, power corrupts. And when you have absolute power, it corrupts absolutely. So when you have a large central government that is involved in so many activities, you have corruption down the entire bureaucracy of the government. And what does that lead to? So if the government's supposed to provide roads for you, you have people stealing funds dedicated for roads, provide schools. You have people not caring about the schools. We hear a lot of stories about Nigerian senators or Nigerian lawmakers being one of the highest paid in the world, actually. So they want to pay themselves and not care about other things. So in general, people think that the government should provide these things. And I'm saying, okay, you think they do, they actually don't. And where they do, it's in horrible condition. So maybe the government should step away from it and let individuals provide those things for themselves, which a lot of Nigerians are doing for themselves. A lot of Nigerians are building their own hospitals. Depending on where you are, a lot of Nigerians live in estates or gated communities where they have their own roads. A lot of Nigerians are building their own waste, solid waste systems. A lot of Nigerians are, building their own water. I remember when I was telling in the US, I was telling some people about boreholes. They couldn't relate to what I was talking about, because I grew up, my family having our own water supply and providing for ourselves. A lot of Nigerians are doing this. So anyway, you expect the government to provide these things for you in Nigeria is usually in very terrible condition. And that's what I was trying to get across at that art in that paragraph.
Well said, Tam. So, as an observer of Nigeria, I do remember several years ago, the Speaker of the House of Representatives was removed. And for a while, that created a train of events in which many politicians were being removed for a number of reasons. So, corruption is obviously an impediment to development in Nigeria.
Yeah, it's not necessarily the cause. I think is a symptom.
Yeah, it's a symptom.
Yeah.
Remember, Tam, Nigerians are not under the influence of classical liberalism. In countries like Nigeria, where the state is engaged in a multitude of activities, people have a tendency to depend on the state to provide resources instead of investing in the free market or individual autonomy. But as you said, Nigerians are capable and able to help themselves. But corruption is usually a function of culture and state issues. So, for example, in economic efficiencies breed corruption. When you create a bureaucracy to regulate the economy, an avenue is open for rent-seeking activities.
Yes, that's exactly what Nigeria is. Some Nigerians think about Nigerians, like I said, do a lot of things for themselves. They just don't have a word for it. So, when you tell them that, when you say, okay, for example, you don't have electricity, so you buy your own power generator and use it for your house. That is you taking your destiny into your own hands. And when you try to explain that we need more of that, and we need the government to step away from the impediments of that. So, for example, the government has a lot of taxes and import duties on things like power generators, like solar panels and all. And secondly, until very recently, the Nigerian electric system was, controlled by the government. So for probably 60 years or more, since 1945, I think, right, even before independence, the electric power system in Nigeria was controlled by the government, and there was no power. I mean, recently, 2013, the industry was broken up into small pieces. So the government owns some parts of it, and private individuals own some parts of it, and there are problems with that. But you see that when you want to import solar panels, you have import duties to pay. First of all, the country doesn't have power, so why are you taxing this? We're trying to provide power for people. So anyway, people try to actually engage in voluntary exchange, it's a lot of government intervention, in those transactions, and that makes those transactions either a lot more expensive. So you could either do two things: you could absorb the cost of those transactions of the regulatory regime, for if we're looking for a word for it. You can add that to the eventual cost of the goods you're trying to produce and make it much more expensive, right? Or you can avoid the formal market and go into black markets to avoid those transactions. And sometimes when you do that, you realize that even with the cost attached to being caught, attached to by security officials or going to prison, is still lower than if you stay in the formal market, and pay for those costs of the regulatory regime. So you have to make your pros and cons do those things in general. So what I'm saying is, if we believe that Nigeria should grow, we need to reduce the involvement of government in our daily activities, especially, and sometimes this way becomes controversial, not just in our personal lives, but especially not in the economic sphere of the country, because economics is really, really important. For example, like inflation that leads to high prices. Many Nigerians are poor, And when you have, food prices increase, they can't afford food, and they resort to other things. So they resort to, crime, they resort to scamming, just because of that small issue. And it's not small, because inflation is a big deal and a big problem, but inflation comes from the government getting involved in the economy through credit expansion, through the banks, or through increasing the money supply. And that is what I'm saying. We need to stop that. Let the government only protect those rights that we had, that were given to us, those inalienable rights that we had, and let individuals figure things out and make accommodations for themselves in general.
People like Garrett Austin will tell us that pre-colonial Africa also had market economies. They may not have been institutionalized to the extent that markets were institutionalized in Europe, but they were markets nonetheless. Secondly, Africa has a history of free states. The state, in a sense, is an anomaly in Africa. As a student, we were told that African societies were usually stateless. Therefore, libertarianism is not incompatible with being an African. How do you sell this message?
No, it's not. Yeah, that's exactly what we're trying to preach. And we use a lot of the works of George Ayittey. I'm sure you probably are aware
Yes.
of him. He's an economist from Ghana. And he's done extensive research on pre-colonial African societies, whereby he draws important lessons about how the societies were usually very free markets in nature. And I try to, reference and quote him a lot in my works, especially when he talks about, if you went to a piece of land and you cultivated that land, the land became your property. That was important, when we talk about the factors of production and how people mix their labor with the land. So how do you make unused land your property? By mixing your labor with it. How do you mix your labor? By cultivating it, building a fence around it. And those were big deals then. Very important way of securing property rights, and your property rights were protected. Then, apart from the large empire of Abyssinia today,
Ethiopia,
yes,
yes.
Ethiopia, most of Africa was not feudal in nature. Of course, a lot changed with this Usman Dan Fodio jihad, across the
Repeat what you said about the jihad.
Usman Dan
Oh,
Fodio.
yes, the Sokoto Caliphate, exactly.
Yes, a lot changed, but before those times, a lot of African societies, were either small, engaged in activities that we could call free markets today, even though they didn't have those names for it. And that's the message we're trying to preach, that libertarianism is actually Nigerian, it's actually African, and it's not
foreign.
Yes, it's not foreign. It's
foreign.
not a foreign ideology at all, because we get those accusations that you're bringing this Western ideology here. It's not at all, and the key is the truth is universal. It didn't have to start from somewhere. For example, the numerals, the numbers we use for counting today is Arabic numerals. It came from the Middle East, but it's what we use across the world.
We call them Arabic numerals, although they were actually influenced by Indian learning.
Yeah, exactly. But my point is that it's not, a Western, because people threw away the Roman numerals because it was just cumbersome and complex and unnecessary, which you could say that was the Western way of counting. But the point is, the truth is universal. It could come from different places, and we learn from each other. So you can make the argument, I don't know if anyone has done that before, you can make the argument that the Western idea of classical liberalism or Western idea of libertarianism somehow came from, African indigenous societies.
To an extent, I would
that argument,
yeah,
but it's definitely an argument.
I would say that elements of classical liberal thought can be discovered in African history. So, for example, polycentric sovereignty or decentralization. And Herman Hoppe is a big advocate of decentralization. And when you study the structures of African societies, they are decentralized. There is a council for the elders. The women have their own societies. Traders also have their unique societies, etc. Because the state is not a formal institution on a grand level. The state operates more at the level of the individual. And I'm happy that you referred to the universalism. Knowledge is not unique to any one group of people, tribe, or race. The Sokoto Caliphate, for example, conquered the northern states of Nigeria, changed their culture, but some of their policies that were deemed to be efficient were actually adopted by the Sokoto Caliphate. If a foreign policy is useful, then adopt it. That makes perfect sense. And this is one of the reasons why the West became wealthy, because Western society was easily rejuvenated by foreign principles.
Hmm.
The
Yeah,
Chinese and the Japanese were less likely to change. And even though after the Meiji Restoration, Japan became like the West, it still retained Japan's culture. So
yeah,
economically, it became Western, but socially, it was still Japanese.
yeah, yeah. I mean, you're right. You know, certain things, even though they come from somebody else, as long as they're good ideas and you can find a way to fit them within your existing institutions without causing too much, breakdown of the social structure, should be adopted. And that's part of what we talk about because um, Nigeria, when we are currently in the Fourth Republic, but by the Third Republic, they decided to, move away from the British parliamentary system and use an American presidential system. For whatever benefit that could have provided them, they decided to do that. So people change, and people change for whatever reason. Sometimes it's not necessary that something is a bad idea, but sometimes some things have a record of being bad ideas. Some ideas have led to the murder and killing of a lot of people, and we know those ideas are horrible ideas, and we, stop, don't use those ideas. But the key is understanding and being honest with yourself, being honest with history. Many of us are not very conversant with history. We like to ignore it a lot, so that's why we repeat it. But when you read a lot of history and you're honest, in general, you know what is a good and what is a bad idea, because most ideas are not new under the sun, and many of them have records of being implemented and what happened after they were implemented. You don't have to change your your social institutions just the way the Gulf states, started to change in the 70s, and today are, I mean, Dubai is the financial center of the world, but fundamentally they didn't change their culture. They just adopted a good idea from somewhere and decided to find a way to how to incorporate with their current social structures. And that's what I think that we need, especially in Nigeria, to relearn. Talk about these ideas more and actually run with respect to elections on ideas and not necessarily power grabbing exercises.
Exactly, cheap politics. The policy you're referring to is called benchmarking. The Germans and the French appropriated British technology. However, unfortunately, people in the black developing world are hesitant in their decision to adopt Western technology and culture. To an extent, they conflate Western culture with oppression and slavery. And this is quite unfortunate because slavery was abolished in the West. And Nigeria, like many places in the developing world, has a history of slavery. The Sokoto Caliphate had slaves. Benin had slaves. In West Africa, the Dahomey also had slaves. So it is just sheer hypocrisy and cheap politics.
There, it's yes, you're right, and there's a lot complex, and there are you understand that in general people like power, and when you want to acquire some level of power, if the zeitgeist of the time kind of supports you, you can ride that wave. So you can talk, misinform the electorate and talk nonsense basically, and get elected. But because not a lot of people spend time thinking through ideas or thinking through certain types of policies and thinking, because people are so much more busy with their lives. And this is why we push for the ideas of classical liberalism and libertarianism, because in that case, the bureaucracy of the government is so small that actions that take place in those bureaucracies have little to no effect on your life as an individual. Because now, if you want to, for example, across different government agencies, across different countries, there are legislative processes going on right now. And those processes are laws are being written that are going to affect people's lives. But very few people have time to pay attention to those in general. Very few people have time. So how do you sit down and pay attention to what this guy is saying? Or during an election, you're pro something, you're pro the environment, but the person you support supports the environment, but supports something else you don't support. You now see him as a package deal, even though you don't agree with what he's saying half the time. You can choose, but in the marketplace, you can choose easily. If you think one producer is horrible, you can go to the next producer. If you think one idea is terrible, you can go to another idea. In that case, your life is less affected by activities that go on in capital cities, like Washington or like Abuja, or like
Lagos.
that mostly Abuja, but like London and all those places, your life is less affected by decisions that take places within the corridors of power in those places, because those people don't have as much power to affect your life. That's the goal. Very, very, very small government, as Mencken would say, a government that escapes, that barely escapes being called a government at all.
Yes, I read this book, Notes on Democracy. So, Tam, what you're basically saying is that Nigeria needs a stronger civil society. In other words, you are affiliated with a group called Nigeria Police.
No, Nigeria Police is an online
Yeah, it's
magazine
an
that
online magazine,
yes, that I
and you
publish.
contribute to Nigeria Police. And are you affiliated with an African think tank? What's the name of it again?
Yeah, so I co-founded the Nigerian Libertarian Project, and I'm also a senior fellow at African Liberty. So through these channels, I try to do a lot of work with respect to education, advocacy, and research, largely on important issues. Largely, we look at the Land Use Act of 1978, and that is a big one for us. And we're also looking at alternatives to policing. Yeah, those are major, and also money and banking, because right now Nigeria is experiencing heavy inflation of various goods. So we look at the role of the central bank. Why does inflation happen? Sometimes you have to even go fundamentally to explain what is money in itself. Then you build up on that. Why are many Nigerians very much interested in cryptocurrencies now? And why are they losing faith in their currencies? For the life of me, which is really, really unique in my lifetime, 2 cases of hyperinflation has happened. 2 horrible cases, Venezuela and Zimbabwe, and somehow people still believe that the central bank should continue increasing the money supply, increasing credits through the banks. It blows my mind, that we've seen actually happen, too. And that's rare, because those hyperinflation is not very, very common. When you look at the history, you could look at the history, but in 10 years, or less than 10 years, I believe, 2 cases of hyperinflation happened, where people, will see millions of, I think it's called bolivars, right? That's the Venezuelan currency, or the Zimbabwean dollars, millions in the basket, and throw away the billions and steal the basket. That's how horrible their currencies have become. And so these are issues that we talk about. We try to inform the Nigerian population about, and we're new in general. A lot of all this started in 2018. So slowly but gradually, and there are other organizations in Nigeria too, like the Chala Institute, the Students for Liberty, which is one of the largest, in fact, the largest liberty-focused organization in Nigeria. They probably have a chapter on almost every campus. They do an amazing work. amazing work. And organizations like this, our goal is to push and show people that these ideas are actually African. They're not foreign to us. This is what we did. Let's go back to the basics and rethink. Maybe we can use certain institutions that were developed at the West, but this time around we would understand to incorporate these institutions with our local indigenous institutions. For example, the institution of Ajo. It's a very interesting, because in general people think that Nigerians are not honest, which is
Yes,
false.
that's a perception that Nigerians are
Yeah,
dishonest.
it's false, because Ajo is what Ajo is basically a group of people come together and donate a certain amount of money every month. Then one person would take that pot. So for example, if 5 of us worked in the same place and 5 of us would decide every month we would donate maybe $50 from our salary to that pot, and one person would take it for 5 months. So that's how everyone will be able to, benefit from that. And this is remarkable because there is no third party to verify any of this. There's no background check. Most of the time, the 5 people are strangers to each other. Maybe only one person knows another person there. And most of the time, this people always get paid. So the 5 people will get paid for 5 months, and they can decide to do it again with different people. This is a remarkable system that has existed for years, and our organization is trying to understand the Adjust system and research it more, because it's honestly completely remarkable that people, in some cases, I'm learning, live in different parts of the country, completely strangers, and they do it through WhatsApp. It's just mind blowing, and it works. And those are examples of, in the West we would call that what's the word, credit union banking, or mutual aid. But these things have
Social,
existed for
social,
years.
social capital and trust are essential for capitalist economies to flourish. Actually, some argue that free market reforms are more successful in high trust societies, and one function of civil society is to generate trust, generalized trust, not limited trust. An edge which the West has or had over other countries for many years was higher levels of trust. When people trust each other, they're more likely to form collaborations with strangers and innovate. So, for example, the Igbo people created an apprenticeship system known as the Igba Odibo. I'm sure you're familiar with this system. It was actually profiled recently by Harvard Business Review and BBC and many other publications. And without trust, the system would have failed.
I agree. I think the only part that would push back a little bit on was how some of the Western societies may have had an edge because they were much more trustworthy. I think it's much more complex than that. We need to. There's a lot of history that we need to read to understand that. So, for example, a lot of Nigerian societies were very trustworthy to one another, especially within the society. The idea that the village raises a child was really, really important. And up until when I was a kid, you did something, you didn't know anyone saw you. The other day you heard your mom hear it, and you were like, how did she hear that I did this stuff? Somebody probably saw you and reported it to your mom. And this was this, but when, and I need to be careful here. So when a lot of our societies were colonized by the West, it's not, you don't blame Nkrumah for taking the stance he took in general, where he took a very socialist stance in his policies, because what he was seeing in the West was different from what they were practicing in London. Colonial masters had, beautiful houses, live like kings basically in African societies. And they became, so if you, for example, as a Nigerian, worked for the colonial government or worked for one of the colonial masters you served, you lived in a place called government is becoming a residential area now, and it was a secluded, beautiful society, different from where you were coming from. You started to aspire to that, and that started to create a different type of culture. around dishonesty, around issues with trust, because people started to get jealous of one another. I think the history is a lot more complex. For example, Tsarist Russia was fairly honest until after the Soviets came over, and honesty became basically not nonsense, because you had to go on the black markets to buy food. You had to lie all the time. Many times our political structures destroy our social institutions very, very easily. And this doesn't happen in 1 year. This happens over many years. And sometimes it's hard to get that back. And you can sit back a society many years, and it's always hard to come back forward and get that again. So for example, when the barbarians invaded Rome, the West was set back by centuries, just because of that simple fact. Although Rome was developing and great and wonderful, but after they lost to the barbarians, they were basically set back by many years. And that's just an example how certain types of political institutions come, because most times people don't do what they don't want you to do. People don't do what they say. They do something else completely
They don't
different.
practice what they preach.
Exactly. They don't practice what they preach. So I think it's a lot more complex than that. And I think that we can be honest with ourselves without necessarily apportioning blame, because then blame doesn't lead to any reasonable solution. But we can be honest about certain parts of our history and look at what has worked and what has not worked, and how we can set up certain institutions within our own local institutions that does not negate or destroy our local, instead amplifies it and makes it better. For example, the system of Agile, I just think is an amazing system. Now we have apps or financial companies that are coming up to develop some type of verification system around, Agile in itself, to basically make that process a lot more
Efficient.
a lot more efficient. Exactly. To even access, so not necessarily 10 people. Now you can have more people, probably 20, probably 30 coming together to doing this. But that's an example of how we can apply either modern technology from any parts of the world, either from China or from the West, to our own local institutions, and amplify them and make them better and more efficient. And I think that's what we need to think about more. And to do that, which we're doing, we need to keep the government away from economic life. You don't need government. It's remarkable because in Lagos, for example, after these ride hailing services, because there's this thing called Okada we have a lot in Nigeria.
Yeah, I know that Kadama because of the Nigerian movies.
Exactly. Wonderful. You watch Hollywood a lot. So there were companies that started some type of Uber solution to that. And first of all, they placed heavy licenses on them. Then they just banned them outright. And you're shocked, because these companies together have raised probably tens of millions of dollars, destroying people's investments overnight. When we look deep into it, we realize that our problems are not necessarily us as people, but the institutions that we have embodied in the state/the government. So what you want to think about is, how do we reduce that? And that's the key. How do you reduce the size of the government? That decisions made by bureaucrats has little to no effect on your life, because that is a big deal. What people sign into law can affect you for years. And before you can repeal a law, it takes so much effort, fight against special interests. The key is, don't pass that law at all in the first place. If we need to be honest with ourselves, we need to do cost benefit analysis of many laws that have been passed in the past that we have repealed today, and see the dangers and the hurt and the horrible things those laws have done. Then maybe we will be much more circumspect to thinking about ways to control people's lives up to the minutiae level.
But bureaucracies erect artificial barriers to interactions. So for example, in communist societies, people are less trusting and also less moral. Many studies, empirical studies have shown that free markets promote trust, tolerance, and diversity. Bureaucracies impede human interaction. So instead of acting in the marketplace by relying on a colleague, you are being informed by a bureaucrat, and as a result, you are likely to develop distrust, because bureaucrats, in order to increase their own salaries and prestige, may engage in illicit activities. So this is one argument against bureaucracies. They don't promote trust, at least inefficient bureaucracies. Singapore is a bit different, but then again, Singapore is an anomaly on so many levels. Singapore had Lee Kuan Yew literally set the tone. Most countries do not have a Lee Kuan Yew.
Yeah, I'm very careful to talk about people like Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, and there are very little factors. Largely Singapore is ethnically homogeneous. It's a very small city state. There are other factors that
Well,
affect.
it is a small city state, but most leaders are not as intelligent or charismatic as Lee Kuan Yew. And in the early years, Lee Kuan Yew actually promoted diversity. So Singapore is an anomalous case because of the factor of Lee Kuan Yew, size, and geopolitical influence, but mostly Lee
You're
Kuan Yew
right.
and leadership abilities. But in the grand scheme of things, the average country will not end up like Singapore.
Yeah, that's one part, and number two is Lee Kuan Yew is not. I think the key that we should ask is Lee Kuan Yew in his own case is unique. One thing he did, and in his book, he said one time he came for an event. He was invited with other head of states, and he saw planes by head of states parked in the hangars, and they were paying money, a lot of money, just for those planes. And he asked them, "Why are you guys doing this? This is you come from poor countries. Why is spending money?" Lee Kuan Yew is unique, and I do not, in my analysis, I try to avoid people like that because they're not good examples. Everybody thinks they will be a benevolent
No,
dictator.
no, I know. Most people remember power can corrupt human nature, and Lee Kuan Yew was not easily corrupted. This was a man who created a meritocracy. He was unflinching in his ability to fire incompetent people and corrupt people. The average leader is not like Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew was exceptionally committed to the larger goal of making Singapore a developed country.
Yeah, and he was willing to learn. He made sure that schools were taught, people learned in English because he understood the power of being able to access knowledge. Sometimes we have issues with the English language because a lot of us is not our local language, but so much knowledge has been written in the English language that for a person who does not speak English, who can't read English, and a person who can read English, it's a big difference. Many languages have, and it's unfortunate, but the world is an unfortunate place. And if we start to lay blame to people, that's where we don't necessarily get the solutions that we want, because then the value becomes in blaming other people. You can go so many, for example, David Hume encouraged Scottish people. I think this was encouraged. It was like in the 17th century or maybe later, earlier than that. Encouraged Scottish people to learn English because they were backwards. And that was rare. Because most people get upset and jealous that the other people are doing better.
It's being pragmatic, and this is why today scholars argue that the Scots invented the modern world. Superior cultures are easily revolutionized by foreign cultures. It is just pragmatic.
Yeah, the Scots are backward by any. They were probably barbarians, but their intellectuals understood that their problems and said, okay, maybe we should learn the English language. Now, very few people speak Scottish. You go to Scotland, almost everybody speaks English. So, but people think that, to the extent that people think that, I think English is the language Scottish people speak, but that's not correct. And this was also the case with the different societies, and this was the case with Japan too. They realized that they were backward. And
Fukuzawa Yukichi, I love him. Fukuzawa Yukichi, like Lee Kuan Yew, was also unflinching in his ability to transform Japan. He was not afraid to call Japan backward.
Yeah, and
self-reflection is important.
But many times we don't have that. Instead, we have intellectuals talking nonsense about importance of this or that. You know, history is, life is hard, life is unfair, life is many times unfortunate. The best we can do is to make the best with what we have to help future generations. You see, sometimes a lot of um, a lot of recriminations are what I would call unnecessary and probably, or maybe counterproductive is the right word. Because when you think about it, things, horrible things have happened to many people, and we need to stop thinking about people as intertemporal abstractions. We need to think about flesh and blood human beings today, and that is important. Flesh and blood human beings today. What decision am I making that's going to affect somebody's life somewhere in the village working? That is important. It's not a small thing. When the central bank decides to print more money, that has effect in the economy, and it almost always doesn't affect, you know, the upper class or the rich. It affects the poor heavily because, first of all, they get the money late, and by the time they get the money, prices have risen and their purchasing power has come to almost, you know, reduced by huge percents. And that is the problem. We need to start thinking about, you know, the decisions we're making. Um, Someone will say, if for example, you're not responsible, there's no cost to you for being wrong, you should never make a decision. If there's a cost, a personal cost to you for being wrong about a decision, then maybe you're in the right place to make that decision. Maybe you think through the decision you're going to make. But that's not always the situation. That's not always what life gives us. That's why, again, we talk about reducing government bureaucracies so more people can have more control over their own personal.
But Tam, so years ago, Asimuglu and Robinson produced a path-breaking paper. They wrote Reversal of Fortune and the Colonial Origins of Economic Development. And the conclusion of your articles is that in the countries where Europeans created extractive institutions, today these countries are poorer. And this is often invoked by anti-colonial writers to impute negative intentions to modern Europeans. But this is the joke, Tam. Extractive institutions existed in the developing world prior to Europe. That's point number one. And point number two, these extractive Europeans were consistent with the policy of socialism. Socialism is a form of extraction. So one way to repudiate the legacy of colonialism is to become a capitalist. Colonialism is closer to the left than capitalism. Colonialism is a socialistic system. The British implemented extractive institutions in Jamaica and other countries because of socialist leanings.
You know, I agree to all that.
You're laughing. I don't know why you're laughing. Maybe you're saying this guy is just so outrageous. I don't know.
No, I'm not. I agree to all that. Oh, it's an interesting. I've never heard anyone say that.
So for example,
so it's really
the state is naturally parasitic. Therefore, in the absence of colonialism, the state will invest in extractive institutions. Colonialism was influenced by socialism and mercantilism. Therefore, extractive institutions are a legacy of colonialism. After colonialism, countries like Botswana went right, other countries opted to go left, and they maintain these colonial institutions that are extractive, and today they refuse to abolish them. So for example, in Jamaica, it is frequently argued that we're in a bad space due to the legacies of colonialism. However, one institution is impeding growth in the agricultural sector. It should be abolished. It is the legacy of colonialism, but politicians are afraid to touch it.
Yeah, I'm usually, you know, as libertarians, we don't say left or right.
Yeah, they're meaningless terms, but most people are familiar with left and right.
We think that's nonsense. Instead, we say we go up. But what I wanted to say to that is again, we need to be honest with ourselves. Many of us are not being honest with ourselves. We need to look at the incentives and constraints on specific individuals. Now, what is the incentive for a politician? What is his major goal?
He thrives on power.
exactly, and getting reelected.
And bureaucracies complement his
that
power.
is the major goal. You know, that is the key. He would say anything. I can tell you, pull records of any politician in the last 40 years that has been a politician for 30 years or more. You see how their opinions vacillate according to the zeitgeist of time, according to what would get them elected. That is not necessarily a bad thing, in my opinion. What is a bad thing is the power those decisions they make have on other people's lives. And if we're being honest with that, if we're actually being honest with that, then we can understand that it's not the British government putting those licenses on the Okada hailing services companies.
Not at all.
No, it's not. It's the Nigerian, it's the Lagos state government doing this. Let's be honest about ourselves. That is not a legacy of colonialism. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Of course. At some point, man must become responsible for his actions. Revanchism cannot induce growth. You cannot rely on grudges to create a wealthy country.
I mean, there are horrible things that have been done, and I'm not going to belittle that at all. Any student of history would be shocked. People have done each other horrible things, and in many cases, when these horrible things have had the opportunity to spread and to be large, is usually behind a large government. For example, Stalin would have not been able to kill 20 million people, if not for the size of his government. You know, these dangerous leaders who definitely are not Lee Kuan Yew, who get the power of the state, can invoke serious havoc on people's lives across the world. And that is what we talk about. We need to be honest about ourselves and think about institutions we have, and think about what power do these institutions have? What can they do? How can they affect other people's lives? What are decision makers? What are the incentives? What are the constraints that affect them from making these decisions? When we are honest about ourselves, then we can chat, of course, on being much more, on creating a better standard of living for ourselves. Today, the best system of creating a standard of living is when you have very, very little government intervention on the lives of
and Chama,
lives and economic lives.
Chama, the evidence is quite clear. Our viewers may go and read the Economic Freedom of the World Index published by the Heritage Foundation or the Fraser Institute, or they can peruse the document of the Cato Institute, or read Robert Barrow or the ECB study on the relationship between government spending and economic problems. Mm-hmm. State size is a predictor of economic growth and prosperity. Japan and China are exceptions, but then there is a counterfactual. In the absence of the government, would these countries have been more innovative? Maybe, because the state is a more inept allocator of resources than the private sector.
That's correct.
So it is, we always have to look at the parallels between the unseen benefits, the seen benefits and the unseen costs.
The unseen cost, yes. Correct.
Government, there is a stronger relationship between business expenditure on R&D than with government expenditure on R&D. Yes, people often refer to the internet and the defense agency, but these technologies were commercialized by the private sector, not the government. The government has different incentives. The government wants to control, private entrepreneurs are interested in making money.
Making profits in general.
Yes, they want to make money. Profit, money, differences, but you get the point. And another issue is that people who live in developing countries or who are born in developing countries need to be more pragmatic. So for instance, the entire issue of intellectual property, if Nigerians create a product and the property was never commercialized by Nigerians, then somebody from Australia may relocate to Nigeria and get a patent, and you cannot blame the Nigerians because, you cannot blame the Australians because the Nigerians lacked foresight. People often say Jamaicans created reggae, but France and Japan are the meccas of reggae. So what? The Japanese and the French have business and intellectual acumen. Talent is important, but commercialization has been proven to be even more significant. I respect inventors, but if you're serious about your work, you should commercialize it. And if you're uninterested in making money, then allow other people to exploit the fruits of your labor.
Yeah,
The world is not sitting and waiting on developing countries to say, do you know what? We need to commercialize this product. So for example, indigenous knowledge in Nigeria, like plants, some plants may be linked to medicinal properties. Like in Jamaica, many of our plants have medicinal qualities, yet we do not have a booming pharmaceutical sector. Why? The lack of initiative of the private sector and the government. The government's role is to facilitate enterprise, not to be the driver of growth. Individuals, people like me and you, we are the real engine of growth.
I mean, you're right. It's not, again, I would say we're talking about flesh and blood human beings. Things are usually much more complicated when we have human beings involved. That's why the social sciences are called the soft sciences, because people vacillate and people are
they vacillate, they're irrational and they're emotional and they're also sentimental.
I don't know. I usually don't use the word irrational because I think that
some actions are irrational.
It's possible, but in that space of making that decision, some people think that what they're doing is the right thing. It might be usually ex post that we say that decision was irrational. But that's by the way. What I wanted to say was people would figure stuff out. And this is not necessarily a simple state. It just feels like that's hard for people to get when you say nobody should tell people what to do, especially adults. It feels hard. But let's look at an example of Somalia. I've spent some time reading about Somalia because it was one of the first, probably the only state in my lifetime that was at some point in time a complete anarchy. Peter Leeson has done a lot of research.
Yeah, I would love to have him on this show. Peter.
Yeah, he's done a lot of research on Somalia, and he discovered that when there was no state, there's no central government, and in the absence of violence, that was key. When the fighting had come to either a stalemate or some type of shaky truce, the standard of living of the average Somali improved when there was a state, because there was almost no restriction or regulation what people could do. Number of cell phones increased, televisions increased, hospitals increased, and this is shocking to a lot of people. He has multiple papers about it. More, and he has a book about it. I think the book is called Boundless. I don't remember the title of the book. I would find it. But he has multiple papers about this, and this was a situation where, wow, I mean, this is an extreme situation where there was actually no government, not because and horrible things happened. And let's be honest, a lot of those things became worse and exacerbated because of certain activities of, emergency aid that was being given, then stopped because one government thought that it was supporting a specific terrorist group. So they stopped the aid and people started suffering. But when all that died down, the standard of living of Somalis improved and became better. We don't have to have the level of violence and bloodshed for us to realize that maybe we can peacefully reduce our government sizes and see what happens after that.
This is what Hop refers to as the Hobbesian myth. He doesn't believe that the state is a benevolent dictator. Answer, man, Hop?
I don't think the state is a benevolent dictator.
Yeah, he doesn't share that view any at all. He calls it the Hobbesian myth. But so for a while, we started to discuss Nigeria, then we began to interrogate classical liberalism, and now we're just referring to examples from various developing countries. Therefore, we must revert back to Nigeria. Price controls are a barrier to energy security in Nigeria, just like land controls. Give us some examples.
I mean,
And
one
you list
example.
some of these examples in your article published for the Journal of Libertarian Studies.
Yeah, one of the basic example is electricity, right? If you have a price that is not the market price, that is less than the market price, very little of that good will be produced. This is basic economics. This is not complex at all. You know, there are economists that differ on different ideas, but the fact of demand and supply with respect to price is basic. Any economist that says this is not true is not worth his salt. Um, um, when you set a price that is below the market price, very few things will be produced. When you set a price, and that will lead to shortages, right? When you sell a price higher than the market price, a lot will be produced, and that will lead to wastages. And that is exactly what it is. The Nigerian government, through its very different agencies, have done that in different, what's the word,
Yeah, in
has done
different
that
capacity and jurisdiction.
in different capacities, exactly, in electricity, in petroleum, and they set a price, and that is not the market price. We don't even know what the market price would be.
Tam,
Because
your paper is right in front of me, so let me read an excerpt.
I go
Government
ahead.
oil refineries are not operational. Hence, Nigeria, though one of the world's largest producers of oil, is still very dependent on the importation of refined petroleum products.
That is that's a
Beautiful.
factual statement, yes.
Yeah, beautiful. The government is misallocating resources as we expected, as we expect politicians to do. Remember, bureaucrats and politicians are motivated by different incentives. They are not entrepreneurs. And when they do become entrepreneurs, they reflect bureaucratic interest, public choice.
Yes, because when you look at, I mean, the refinery is key, right? How do you finance a refinery? You finance it with billions of dollars spread over 20 to 30 years. Project finance, basically the cash flow of the refinery goes to service its debt for that long. That is how you finance a refinery. Anybody who spent that kind of resources to finance a refinery must ensure that the refinery produces at the minimum every day to ensure that it has enough cash flow to meet its debt obligations. The government is not one of those. None of those incentives exist. The money is already sunk and it's gone forever. The Nigerian people who are supposed to be the investors never get a return for their investment. So hence, there is no incentive to make those refineries work. That is simple. We don't have to go to the details of project finance talk about this, but that is basic stuff. Why would you want to spend more money to fix a refinery? Because as a private entrepreneur, that if you build a refinery and you're not producing, you're not meeting your daily quota, you might not be able to meet your obligations
You're
from
going
the
to
government.
fail. Yes, just say it, you're going to fail.
Basically, yes.
Yes, you're going to fail.
You're not going to make, and that is key. So you want to incentivize production. You always want your refineries to be operating. Sometimes it's hard. As an entrepreneur, I know for a fact that this is really difficult business, especially the key, especially when you finance large energy assets in the developing world. Meeting your obligations usually, depending on your agreement, is it a monthly or quarterly, is really difficult business because you're trying to engage your customers to utilize more so you can have enough cash flow. And for years, you don't make any profit. That's a fact. For years, probably for as much as 10 years. And when you keep on servicing that debt, sometimes you only make enough to service your interest on that debt. And you're like, oh God, what am I going to do? Time for the principal is about to arrive. The maturity date is coming close. These are complexities that personal entrepreneurs deal with and have to figure out because many times their reputation, their businesses are on the line, but it's not the case of politicians. They just
I'm happy that you referred to reputational risk. So, for example, a study was just published saying that big businesses are less likely to deceive customers because if they do so, they will lose their reputation.
yeah, that's key. That's important. You go to a small town, you don't walk into, and a small town where you don't know anybody, you don't walk into a random mom and pop shop, you walk into a McDonald's. For the fact that you believe a McDonald's has specific requirements and specific branding that would ensure that the food produced there is not dangerous to your health. And you know that if anything happens to you, you can sue a multi-billion-dollar corporation easily. So that is really, that's why, except, you go into a town where you know somebody and tell, McDonald's is horrible. This mom and pop restaurant is better. Let's go there. Then that person has replaced the brand of McDonald's for that limited information you have at that moment.
Tam,
Branding.
I agree with you, Tam. But back to your article, there is an interesting twist. So, as students of economics, we are familiar with the resource curse. Nigeria is rich in resources like many countries in Africa, but you contend that the issue is that property rights are insecure in Nigeria, and with secure property rights, the resource curse can be alleviated. And I agree with you to an extent. During 1972 to 2007, productivity in Jamaica declined. Jamaica's productivity rate is low, and there's a saying in Jamaica, it's a popular saying, and it has been popularized by the media. One person of Chinese stock is able to do the job of 5 Jamaicans. So Jamaica's problem is productivity. When we compare Nigeria to Jamaica using the index of property rights in Jamaica are actually more secure, but it is unproductive. The greatest barrier to property rights in Jamaica is political interference. So, for example, people may squat on properties and they don't own them. And there have been cases where politicians intervene to defend the squatters. And by doing so, they are sending a negative signal to foreign investors. But I do agree with you in the case of Nigeria. The issue is not so much that resources are corrupting the political elite, but that property rights are insecure.
Yeah, that's exactly my point in the article, where I try to show that it doesn't necessarily matter. The resource curse doesn't necessarily hold when people own their property, because if not, how did the southern part of the US develop? It was the oil. How did America basically develop? It was largely people owned the resources that they found on their land, basically, and they could decide for themselves. And this is not just a statement of ownership, it's economics, in the sense that, first of all, we need some type of political situation to decide what property is and who owns property, and to defend that property. That is beyond the scope of economics. But now when we go down into economics, people value things very differently. And you can
when they own them. Yes.
You can only efficiently value something you own. That is not a small statement to make, because you know the opportunity cost of not using that resource. No other person has that knowledge. It's inside your head, not inside somebody else's head. That is key, and you know the opportunity cost of not using that. So you can determine if you want to use that asset to produce something or not. And when you do that, market prices arise because of the exchange ratios that go on. And when market prices arise, market prices send a signal to people about the scarcity of the resources available and the valuations of specific goods available with respect to their prices. And people can see that and make decisions based on that. Through that process, scarce resources, let's be clear, resources are scarce resources in an economy moves from places that they're needed to from places that they're less needed to places that they're needed. A good example is the pandemic. Now, there were a lot of government interventions in the pandemic, so it's not a good example, but let's use it in general. Now, the pandemic had a situation whereby people stopped going to work into their offices and stayed home, right? Hence, we needed a lot more video conferencing. What happened to the stock prices of Zoom?
It's going to go up because of the demand.
Zoom now had more money to hire engineers that might have lost their jobs in other industries. So, for example, engineers who worked in the real estate industry might have lost their job, or commercial real estate, because nobody went to work anymore. To hire those engineers to service the high demand for Zoom services. That was the economy directing resources from parts of the economy that is no longer needed to parts of the economy where it was needed. And it only did that because of the price signals about that. That was it. And in some cases, or price signal resulting from the demand of specific services. And this is what I was saying in that article. When people have control over their land, and the oil in their land, they can decide how to use it or not. And I give the example of the Audubon Society, who basically is a natural conservancy.
And sorry,
And they
this is
have
an
oil.
American group. I just want our readers to know this is an American group.
That is an American organization, yes. So they are a natural conservancy, I think, and they own a lot of property where they use them as sanctuaries for different animals. And in one of their properties in Louisiana, oil was discovered, and the organization actually allowed the oil companies to actually drill for oil, but with specific and very tight and narrow conditions. They couldn't spill oil, number one. They could not drill during breeding season. Number two, this was remarkable, and this worked for over 20 years, over 2 decades, I believe. And
Yes.
Audubon was able to make over 20 something million dollars in royalties from the oil company. It was a win-win situation. It wasn't a zero-sum game, but that transaction could only take place because the property was privately owned and there was very little government intervention in that transaction between Audubon and the oil companies. That was
The
it.
PERC, the Property and Environmental Research Center, is a good resource place for those interested in examining the association between property rights and biodiversity and an increase in the stock of various animals and life forms.
Correct.
Property
Yeah.
rights motivate us to invest in the environment. I actually have a piece on the topic for Mises. When countries become rich, afforestation will increase and deforestation will decline. Afforestation is a benefit of luxury. Rich people are likely to invest in the environment because they have money. Poor people are likely to abuse the environment. And this is one of the reasons why some hunter-gatherer societies did not have strong environments. They failed to invest in property rights, but there are obviously exceptions to the rule. There are societies that did invest in property rights. There are always exceptions to the rule.
Yeah, I mean, in general, it doesn't have to be rich and poor. It's just a situation whereby standard of living across board of everybody, in the societies with very little, where more people live in poverty, don't necessarily care about, they care about eating food, that's the major goal. They care about feeding and clothes, and they don't have resources to think about other things. But in societies where people are much more well off, they think more about other things because those basic needs are met. And so that's, basically it, what we talk about when you want to strive to make your society a much more wealthier society. If you want to do that, you want to get the government away from economic life.
And
That
we
is,
also need environmentalists to appreciate property rights. So in Jamaica, people oppose mining and they do have legitimate concerns. However, mining can be done in a way to mitigate the negative effects of the activity. And furthermore, new technologies have been created to alleviate some of the problems associated with mining. You rightly said resources are always scarce. However, it is the paradox of scarcity. Human ingenuity is unlimited. So even though resources are scarce, because we're so brilliant, we're always creating more resources. So technology can minimize land use. So on the one hand, we say, oh, mining will deplete natural resources, but due to our intelligence, we can create technologies to reduce the impacts of mining and thus replenish the environment. Environmentalists need to think in using this outlook.
yeah, I mean, PERC is a great organization and they do amazing work. They basically would change your outlook when you read a certain book.
Yes.
By what? Because many times this is not obvious, because not all of us live close to a wildlife sanctuary. So you need people who have actually seen this, and they're in Montana, which is, west, and very, very a place where people actually love nature a lot and the environment.
Yes.
It boils down to the fact that if it's your property, you're much more interested in
You're going to invest in it because
what
the
it looks like.
returns are greater. Exactly.
Exactly, because you think about the capital value, you think more, you're not interested in short-term profits at all. You're thinking about the long-term capital value of your asset. And that is really, really important. And sometimes we ignore that fact. So for example, there's a reason why most of the water bodies in the world today are filled with filth, because nobody owns them. But if you go to private lakes, they're pristine. People who own private lakes, the lakes are pristine.
That's why we should follow Walter Block and privatize the rivers and oceans.
Number two, Walter Block is an interesting man.
Yeah, I interviewed him twice.
When you also yes, and the other example I gave was because, number one, it's an organization in Abuja, the capital, or a government bureaucracy in Abuja, the capital city of Nigeria, that is responsible for environmental protection. In the Niger Delta, the oil companies drill oil with reckless abandon. What they care, they don't own the oil, they don't own the land. What they care about is the profits they can make from short-term drilling that they could do very quickly. So they do and destroy the environment. Now, this is terrible, because the Audubon, they warned the companies, if you spill oil once in the contract, you get off the land and you pay through your nose for that. Audubon could do that. So it's not like, so you can drill with the necessary precautions without spilling. It's actually very possible.
Yes.
But it's expensive, which is actually true. It's actually a lot more expensive to do. But when you are somewhere where people don't care about property rights, and the government that doesn't care about its people gives you the right free hand to do this, you don't care. You just want to get your profits, pay the government its royalty, and get out.
Exactly. But Tam, we've been having an interesting discussion, but unfortunately we're getting too loquacious, so I have to end the conversation. People prefer short videos. Yes, Tam, I'm quite tactless. Yeah, but it was a pleasure to speak to you, but we can continue this conversation. If we continue it, we may never end. So I have to just say bye-bye.
Have a good one. Thanks for having me. Yeah, bye.